The morning of February 23rd, 1945, brought a brief moment of celebration to the Marines fighting on Iwo Jima. Up on Mount Suribachi's summit, the American flag now flew, captured in a photograph that would become one of the war's most enduring images. Below, in the volcanic ash and shattered rock, Corporal Hershel Williams watched men around him fire their weapons into the air in momentary triumph. He fired his rifle once, then turned back to the work at hand. The celebration meant nothing to the men pinned down trying to cross the airfield. The Japanese pillboxes that had stopped the Marine advance were still there, still firing, still killing. Williams served with the 1st Battalion, 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division. 4 days into the battle, he was the only flamethrower and demolition expert his unit had left. The others were dead or wounded. Casualty rates among flamethrower operators had reached 92% in some battalions. The weapon that was supposed to solve the problem of Japanese fortifications had become a death sentence for the men who carried it. His commander called a meeting in a shell crater to keep them out of the line of fire. Would Williams do something about the pillboxes that had them stalled? The question was not really a question. Williams was 5 feet 6 inches tall. The flamethrower on his back weighed 70 pounds when full. He was 21 years old, the youngest of 11 children from a dairy farm in Quiet Dell, West Virginia. He had joined the Marines because he liked their dress blue uniforms better than the Army's brown wool. He knew nothing about what he was walking into. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had spent nearly a year preparing for this moment. Under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, engineers had carved 11 miles of tunnels through volcanic rock. They had built pillboxes with walls 4 feet thick, reinforced with steel and concrete. They had positioned artillery in caves with steel doors that could roll out, fire, and retreat before counter-battery fire could respond. They had created a fortress so thoroughly integrated with the island's terrain that aerial bombardment and naval gunfire had accomplished almost nothing against it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Marines had learned quickly that conventional weapons were nearly useless against these fortifications. Rifles and machine guns couldn't penetrate the concrete. Artillery and naval gunfire often missed the well-concealed positions. Even when shells struck directly, the defenders simply moved through their tunnel system to reoccupy positions from different angles. The Japanese had designed their defenses to maximize American casualties while preserving their own fighting strength for as long as possible. Every yard of ground cost American lives. This was the tactical problem that flamethrowers were meant to solve. Fire could reach into places bullets could not. It could follow the contours of fortifications, seep through ventilation shafts, consume oxygen in enclosed spaces. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers who would fight to the death against rifle fire sometimes fled from flames. But using the weapon required getting close, within 15 to 20 yards for the early models, perhaps 40 yards for the newer versions using napalm. That meant exposing yourself to concentrated fire from defenders who recognized the threat and targeted flamethrower operators with everything they had. Williams moved forward with his weapon, crossing ground no one else could cross, approaching pillboxes that had killed dozens of Marines. What happened over the next several hours would earn him the Medal of Honor. But it would also reveal something about modern warfare that both sides were still learning. The question was not whether flamethrowers worked. The question was what it cost to use them, and what they revealed about the nature of the defenses they were meant to defeat. The Japanese military had not always built fortifications like those on Iwo Jima. Traditional Japanese military doctrine, refined over decades and codified in every training manual since 1909, emphasized offensive action. The U.S. Army's Handbook on Japanese Military Forces noted that defensive combat had been fundamentally distasteful to Japanese commanders, who were reluctant to admit the Imperial Army would ever be forced into such a position. Offense was the path to victory. Defense was admission of weakness. But by 1943, after defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, reality had imposed itself on doctrine. The Japanese Empire could no longer attack everywhere simultaneously. American industrial capacity was producing ships, aircraft, and equipment at rates Japan could not match. The strategy shifted from expansion to delay, from offensive conquest to defensive attrition. If the Americans could be made to pay a terrible price for every island, perhaps they would lose the will to continue the war. Perhaps time could be bought for the defense of the homeland itself. This strategic shift required a complete reimagining of defensive tactics. On Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders had met the Marines at the beach with direct fire from fortified positions. The result was heavy American casualties, but ultimately total defeat for the garrison. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment had destroyed many of the fortifications before the landing even began. The lesson was clear. Surface fortifications, no matter how well built, could not survive modern firepower. The solution was to go underground. On islands across the Pacific, Japanese engineers began a massive construction effort that represented one of the war's most impressive feats of military engineering. They used whatever materials were available. On some islands, reinforced concrete poured with Portland cement created bunkers with walls several feet thick. On others, coral stone and timber supplemented scarce concrete supplies. Natural caves were expanded and interconnected. Artificial tunnels were dug through solid rock. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Mining engineers dispatched from Japan drew blueprints for tunnel systems at varying levels to ensure proper ventilation and minimize the effect of bombs or shells exploding near entrances. Labor came from wherever it could be found. Military engineers, infantry pressed into construction duty, and often conscripted civilians or prisoners of war. Men dug with hand tools through volcanic rock, coral limestone, and dense clay. They installed ventilation shafts to prevent suffocation. They created ammunition storage areas deep underground where explosions on the surface could not reach them. They positioned multiple entrances and exits so that positions could be reoccupied even after they appeared to be cleared. On Iwo Jima, the volcanic terrain offered unique advantages. The island's black volcanic ash, when mixed with Portland cement, created concrete of superior quality compared to conventional mixtures. The natural caves in Mount Suribachi and throughout the island's rocky terrain provided ready-made foundations for defensive positions. By the time American forces arrived in February 1945, Kurebayashi's engineers had created approximately 300 separate fixed fortifications across the 8-square-mile island, ranging from spider holes large enough for a single soldier to multi-story underground headquarters. The pillboxes near the beaches were constructed with reinforced concrete walls up to 4 feet thick. Machine gun positions were carefully sited with interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any position under attack could receive supporting fire from adjacent positions. Artillery was positioned in caves with steel doors, allowing guns to fire a few rounds, then retreat behind protection impervious to counter battery fire. The tunnel system connected all major defensive positions, allowing rapid movement of troops and supplies without exposure to American observation. This was defense in depth taken to its logical extreme. The goal was not to prevent the American landing, which Kurebayashi recognized as impossible. The goal was to make every yard of advance as costly as possible, to bleed the attackers until either reinforcements arrived or the Americans decided the price was too high.
The fortifications were designed to survive bombardment, to remain concealed until the last moment, and to exact maximum casualties before being reduced. Against conventional weapons, these defenses were extraordinarily effective. Against fire, they would prove to have fatal vulnerabilities that their designers had not fully appreciated. When the United States entered World War II in Chattanooga,
December 1941, there was not a single flamethrower in the inventory of the U.S. Armed Forces. The weapon had seen use in World War I, primarily by German forces, but American military planners had largely dismissed it as a specialized tool with limited tactical value. That assessment would change rapidly once American forces began fighting in the Pacific. The Chemical Warfare Service began development work in July 1940. The first experimental model, designated E1, was quickly discarded as inadequate. A revised version, the E1R1, showed more promise during testing in March 1941. It weighed 57 pounds when filled and could sustain fire for 15 to 20 seconds at a range of 15 to 20 yards. The compressed nitrogen propellant system was separated from the fuel reservoir, a feature that would carry forward into all subsequent designs. But problems remained. The weapon was still too heavy, easily damaged, and the control valves were difficult to access under field conditions. Test board suggestions led to the M1 production model, standardized in August 1941. This version was heavier at 72 pounds but more rugged. It had a range of 15 meters and held 5 gallons of fuel in its tanks. The M1 began reaching troops in the South Pacific Theater by the end of 1942. Marines from the 2nd Engineer Battalion used it in combat for the first time on Guadalcanal in January 1943. The results were disappointing. The weapon was unreliable, prone to misfires, and its fuel mixture of gasoline or gasoline-diesel blend burned too rapidly. The flame was mostly consumed just beyond the nozzle, meaning operators had to approach within 10 to 15 yards of their target. The flame also tended to roll off fortified positions rather than penetrate into them. Perhaps most critically, the ignition system using hydrogen and a spark plug was inefficient and prone to failure, particularly in the humid tropical conditions of the Pacific Islands. But the fundamental concept showed promise. In February 1942, the Chemical Warfare Service developed a revolutionary new fuel thickening agent. 2 chemists working under the direction of Harvard professor Louis Fieser combined naphthenic and palmitic acids to create what they called napalm. This mixture, when added to gasoline, created a gel that burned longer, stuck to targets, and could be projected much farther than conventional liquid fuels. The M1 platform was modified to handle napalm, producing the M1A1 in June 1943. The new version weighed 65 pounds and achieved ranges of 40 to 50 yards. The thickened fuel made all the difference. Where conventional gasoline had exploded into a brief bloom of flame, napalm left the flamethrower as a tight, dark-colored jet stream. It adhered to whatever it struck: concrete, steel, wood, or human flesh. It burned at temperatures ranging from 800 to 1200 degrees Celsius, or 1470 to 2190 degrees Fahrenheit. Once ignited, it was nearly impossible to extinguish. The Chemical Warfare Service continued refinement through 1943 and into 1944. The M22 flamethrower, introduced in the summer of 1944, incorporated lessons learned from 2 years of combat use. It featured a more reliable rotary cartridge ignition system that replaced the troublesome hydrogen spark plug arrangement. The weapon still had drawbacks. It was heavy, had a high silhouette that made operators visible targets, and provided only about 7 seconds of sustained fire before the tanks were empty. But it worked, and commanders in the Pacific Theater quickly realized its value. By 1944, Marine divisions had dramatically increased their flamethrower allocation. Early D-Series divisions carried 24 flamethrowers, all organic to the Divisional Engineer Battalion. By the time F-Series divisions deployed to combat, they carried 243 flamethrowers spread throughout the division. Every infantry company had access to the weapon. The tactical doctrine for its use had been developed through bitter experience on islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan. The weapon that had barely existed 3 years earlier had become central to Pacific combat operations. The flamethrower operator's role in the Pacific War was among the most dangerous assignments in the American military. Training for the weapon began at specialized schools where men learned not just how to operate the equipment, but how to stay alive while using it. The M22 flamethrower consisted of 3 tanks welded together onto a backpack frame with shoulder straps. 2 outer cylinders, each about the size of scuba tanks, held 4.5 gallons of fuel. The center tank, slightly smaller, contained compressed nitrogen that propelled the fuel through the system. The firing apparatus required coordination between 2 triggers. One at the front of the wand activated a cylinder containing 5 phosphorus matches that ignited the fuel stream. Another at the rear controlled the flow of fuel using the compressed nitrogen propellant. Marines practiced for hours learning the precise timing. Fire too soon and you wasted precious matches. Wait too long and the enemy had time to kill you. Each flamethrower carried only enough fuel for about 7 seconds of continuous fire, though operators typically fired in short bursts to extend their effective engagement time. The fuel mixture itself had been perfected through extensive experimentation. If you used only diesel, the fluid was too heavy and the flame traveled just a few feet, useless unless you could pour it directly into an opening. If you used only gasoline, specifically 130-octane aviation gas, the flame lacked body and dissipated rapidly into the air. Mixed at a HE 1-to-1 ratio, however, these fuels created a stream that could reach 20 to 30 yards with devastating effect. The diesel oil produced thick black smoke as it burned, creating a visible signature that drew enemy fire like a beacon. Later in the war, stabilized napalm replaced the diesel-gasoline mixture in many operations. The thickened fuel could be projected 40 yards or more, stuck to whatever it touched, and burned with such intensity that it could consume all available oxygen in enclosed spaces. Men caught in sealed bunkers sometimes died from asphyxiation before the flames ever reached them. The napalm burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel in sustained exposure. Flamethrower operators learned quickly that their weapon made them priority targets. Japanese defenders recognized the threat immediately. When they saw a Marine approaching with the distinctive backpack and wand, they concentrated all available weapons on that man. Marine Corps correspondents at Iwo Jima reported that Japanese gunners threw mortar shells not at American units generally, but at individual flamethrowers specifically. The black smoke from diesel fuel allowed enemy observers to track operators even when they were moving. The sharp hiss when compressed nitrogen was released disclosed exact positions to anyone within earshot. The casualty rates reflected this targeting. On Iwo Jima, portable flame units in some battalions sustained 92% casualties, leaving almost no one trained to use the weapon. Operators typically worked in teams of 3, the flamethrower man, a demolition expert carrying pole charges or satchel charges to finish the job after the flames, and riflemen providing covering fire. But often the covering fire was inadequate. Japanese positions were too well concealed, their fields of fire too carefully planned. The flamethrower man had to get close, usually within 20 yards, and once he started firing, his position was completely exposed. Marine Eugene Sledge, who fought on Peleliu and Okinawa, described watching a flamethrower operator during training. The napalm hit a tree stump with a loud spattering noise.
Heat radiated from the impact point. Black smoke rushed upward. Sledge wrote that the thought of turning loose hellfire from a hose nozzle as easily as watering a lawn back home sobered him. To shoot the enemy with bullets or kill him with shrapnel was one of the grim necessities of war, but to burn him to death seemed too gruesome to contemplate. He learned soon enough, however, that Japanese defenders could not be routed from their island fortifications without it. Hershel Williams moved forward across open ground that had already killed dozens of Marines. The pillboxes his commander wanted eliminated were positioned to provide mutual support, each covering the approaches to the others. He had 4 men with him initially, 2 riflemen for covering fire, a demolition expert with pole charges, and another Marine carrying spare flamethrower fuel. Within minutes, the covering riflemen were dead. The demolition man was struck in the helmet by a bullet that knocked him unconscious. Williams was alone. He doesn't remember everything that happened during those 4 hours on February 23, 1945. Some scenes remained vivid decades later, while others disappeared into blank spaces his memory could not fill. He remembered crawling toward one pillbox where he could see the barrel of a Japanese machine gun protruding from a firing slit. Bullets ricocheted off his flamethrower tanks, the metallic pings audible even over the battle noise. He got within 20 to 25 yards and fired. The napalm rolled in a big ball of flame toward the gun port. The firing stopped. He recalled approaching another position when he noticed a wisp of smoke escaping from a ventilation hole in the top. These ventilation shafts were essential design features in Japanese fortifications, allowing air circulation in otherwise sealed positions. But they also created vulnerability. Williams crept to the pillbox roof, inserted the flamethrower nozzle into the vent shaft, and fired. The flames followed the ventilation system throughout the interior space. No one emerged. He said later simply that he got them all. At another point, Japanese soldiers came around a pillbox corner with bayonets fixed, charging directly at him. Williams had to get within 15 yards for the flamethrower to be effective at that angle. Whether the enemy had run out of ammunition or had chosen a bayonet charge for other reasons, he never knew. They came at him with cold steel, and he killed them with fire. The image of men burning, trying to reach him even as flames consumed them, stayed with him. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Williams estimates he used 6 different flamethrowers that afternoon. Each weapon held fuel for only seconds of sustained fire. He would empty one, drop it, return to American lines for another, then advance again. His actions that day destroyed 7 pillboxes and killed the crews inside. For 4 hours, he operated essentially alone in the most exposed position on the battlefield, accomplishing what entire rifle companies had failed to do. But Williams was exceptional. Most flamethrower operators died. The 92% casualty rate in some units reflected the reality that carrying this weapon into combat was nearly suicidal. The Marines became increasingly dependent on mechanized flamethrowers, Sherman tanks modified to carry 300 gallons of napalm with projection systems that could reach hundreds of feet. These flame tanks, built by naval construction battalions in Hawaii under Colonel Unmacht's direction, landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day, but were used sparingly at first. As portable, flamethrower casualties mounted, commanders called more and more for the tank-mounted versions. Marines would hold up their assault until a flame tank was available. Since each tank battalion had only 4 flame tanks, they were pooled and dispatched from refueling locations as needed. Toward the end of the battle, 5th Marine Division tanks expended between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of napalm per day. Over the 36-day campaign, 360,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel were used, both in portable units and in the tanks Marines called Satans or Zippos. The flame tanks had another advantage beyond operator protection. Japanese soldiers feared them. After Iwo Jima, U.S. Army reports from Okinawa noted that flame tanks had a profound psychological presence on the battlefield. American troops preferred to follow them over standard armor because of the fear they instilled in the enemy. One Marine Company commander stated that in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won the battle for Iwo Jima. Inside the fortifications, Japanese defenders experienced something their training and indoctrination had not prepared them for. The bunkers and pillboxes that were supposed to protect them became death traps when flames appeared at the entrances. The ventilation systems that allowed them to breathe became conduits for fire. The multiple levels and connecting tunnels that were meant to allow tactical flexibility became mazes where superheated air and toxic smoke spread through passages, killing men far from where the flames originated. The temperatures napalm produced were beyond anything human bodies could withstand. At 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat alone could kill before the flames arrived. Men positioned 20 or 30 feet from a direct flame strike sometimes died from thermal injuries and smoke inhalation. The fire consumed oxygen so rapidly that defenders in sealed positions suffocated even when the flames never reached their specific location. The reinforced concrete that was supposed to resist artillery shells conducted heat throughout the structure, making entire bunkers uninhabitable. Japanese soldiers who survived flame attacks and were later captured described the experience to American interrogators. The sound came first, the distinctive hiss of compressed gas releasing, then the roar of ignition, then heat so intense it felt like standing next to a blast furnace. The flames were not like ordinary fire. Napalm stuck to surfaces, continuing to burn long after the initial projection. It flowed like liquid, seeking the lowest points, filling depressions, spreading throughout interconnected spaces. Some defenders tried to escape through tunnel systems, only to find that smoke and heat had already filled the passages. Others remained in position, hoping the flames would not reach them, only to die from oxygen depletion as the fire consumed all available air. Those who did escape into the open-faced rifle fire from Marines who had taken positions covering the exits. The choice was to burn inside or be shot outside. Many chose neither, using grenades on themselves rather than face either death. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Japanese military training emphasized dying for the emperor, fighting to the last man, never surrendering. Bushido code and effective propaganda portrayed American soldiers as ruthless animals who would torture and kill prisoners. Better to die fighting or commit suicide than surrender. But fire changed that calculation. The prospect of burning to death, of experiencing those final seconds or minutes of unimaginable agony, broke through the indoctrination. At some defensive positions on Okinawa, Japanese soldiers killed themselves rather than face flamethrowers. American forces reported finding defenders who had committed suicide with grenades or pistols when they heard the sound of flame tanks approaching. Others, their positions already hit once with flames, chose to surrender rather than experience it again. This was unprecedented in Pacific combat, where surrender rates among Japanese soldiers were typically less than 1%. Marine flamethrower operators reported that Japanese defenders concentrated fire on them with an intensity that exceeded normal combat. It wasn't just tactical targeting, it was desperation. Kill the flamethrower operator before he could use his weapon. Every available gun turned toward that single Marine with the distinctive backpack. Mortars that had been conserved for critical targets were fired at individual flamethrower men. Machine gun crews that had held fire to avoid revealing their positions opened up when they saw flames. The fear was not irrational. Fire represented a death that was both horrible and, once begun, impossible to escape. You could dive behind cover when bullets flew, You could survive near misses from artillery. But if napalm stuck to you, you burned until you died, or until someone extinguished the flames. And there was rarely anyone who could help. The carefully constructed fortifications that had cost months of labor and were supposed to enable prolonged resistance collapsed in minutes when flames found their way inside. The defense-in-depth strategy required defenders to hold their positions, but positions filled with fire could not be held. The collision between Japanese defensive doctrine and American incendiary weapons revealed a fundamental vulnerability no amount of concrete could overcome. Hershel Williams survived Iwo Jima. The actions that earned him the Medal of Honor on February 23, 1945, represented just one day in a battle that lasted 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives. President Harry Truman presented Williams with the medal on October 5, 1945, in a White House ceremony. Williams was 22 years old. He would live to be 98, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima, spending his later years advocating for Gold Star families who had lost service members. But survival came with costs that no medal could address. Williams admitted decades later that much of what happened during those 4 hours remained blank in his memory. The mind protects itself from certain experiences by refusing to record them completely. What he did remember, the burning men, the smoke rising from ventilation shafts, the sound of flames consuming everything inside concrete bunkers, stayed with him. He spoke publicly about the battle, but always in measured tones that acknowledged the horror of what he had been asked to do. The flamethrower operators who died on Iwo Jima and other Pacific islands left behind casualty statistics that told their own story. 92% casualties in some units meant that carrying this weapon was effectively a death sentence. These men knew the odds. They watched their predecessors die. They understood that Japanese defenders would target them specifically. They carried the weapon anyway because someone had to, because without it, the fortifications could not be reduced, because refusing would mean leaving their fellow Marines pinned down under fire. The mathematics of this sacrifice were brutal. On Iwo Jima alone, over 30% of all Japanese killed died not from bullets or explosives, but from being incinerated by flamethrowers. 360,000 gallons of fuel projected at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit over 36 days. The portable flamethrowers carried by men like Williams accounted for some of this. The flame tanks, those modified Shermans that could project fire hundreds of feet, accounted for more. Together they made the island's elaborate fortifications penetrable at terrible cost to both sides. For Japanese defenders, survival often meant experiencing something that broke through every level of military indoctrination. Captured soldiers, when interrogators asked about their experiences, described hearing the sound of approaching flamethrowers and feeling fear that overrode their training. Some admitted they had considered suicide rather than face the flames. Others spoke of watching comrades burn, of hearing screams echo through tunnel systems, of smelling burning flesh mixed with diesel smoke. The Bushido code that emphasized death before dishonor confronted a form of death so horrible that even heavily indoctrinated soldiers sometimes chose surrender instead. This was not cowardice. It was human beings reaching the absolute limit of what they could endure. The fact that surrender rates increased in units that had experienced flame attacks demonstrated that even the most rigid military culture had breaking points when confronted with certain forms of suffering. American soldiers who operated flamethrowers carried their own psychological burdens. Eugene Sledge, the Marine who wrote eloquently about his Pacific
combat experiences, never operated a flamethrower himself, but watched those who did. He understood that killing with fire was fundamentally different from other forms of combat killing. It was intimate in a way that rifle fire or artillery was not. You saw exactly what you were doing. You heard it. You smelled it. The weapon gave no distance, no abstraction between action and consequence. Many flamethrower operators, those who survived, did not speak much about their experiences after the war. Some refused to discuss it at all. The weapon had been necessary, they understood that. The fortifications could not have been reduced without it, but necessary did not mean easy to live with. The images, the sounds, the knowledge of what fire does to human bodies, these things did not fade with time. They remained, part of the cost of victory that never appeared in official casualty reports. The flamethrowers' effectiveness against Japanese fortifications revealed something larger than tactical innovation. It demonstrated the industrial and material disparity between the United States and Japan that would ultimately decide the Pacific War. The napalm used in flamethrowers required sophisticated chemical engineering, industrial production capacity, and logistics networks that could deliver hundreds of thousands of gallons of specialized fuel to remote Pacific islands. By June 1945, the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company had developed stabilized flamethrower fuel that could be produced in quantity. They oversaw Naval Construction Battalion construction of an activating plant that produced over 250,000 gallons of napalm. The 713th Tank Battalion went through 200,000 gallons on Okinawa alone. This represented industrial capacity that Japan could not match and could barely comprehend. Consider the logistics chain required to make Williams's actions on Iwo Jima possible. The flamethrower itself was manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Pacific, delivered to the island during the assault. The fuel was chemically formulated, produced, transported in specialized containers, and made available at forward positions where operators could reload between attacks. The compressed nitrogen propellant required industrial gas production facilities, the spare parts, replacement weapons when one was damaged, the training infrastructure that produced operators. All of this represented an industrial system operating at scales Japan could not approach. The flame tanks demonstrated even greater disparity. Each modified Sherman required 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 electrical connections. The conversion cost between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank, equivalent to nearly $360,000 in modern currency. Colonel Unmacht's CB Flame Tank Group produced 354 tanks by war's end. These were given AAA procurement priority, the same designation as the B-29 bomber program and the atomic bomb project. Japan had no equivalent capability. Japanese industrial production struggled to manufacture adequate numbers of conventional tanks, much less specialized flame tanks. The nation's factories operated under severe resource constraints. American submarines had cut off access to oil from Southeast Asia, rubber from Malaya, metals from throughout the empire. What industrial capacity remained was directed toward aircraft production for kamikaze attacks and coastal defense preparations for the anticipated invasion of the home islands. The concrete used in Japanese fortifications on Iwo Jima had been excellent quality, mixing volcanic ash with Portland cement. The engineering had been sophisticated, creating interconnected defensive networks that maximized the terrain's natural advantages. But all of this defensive preparation, all the months of labor by thousands of men, proved vulnerable to weapons that existed only because American industry could produce them in quantity. American forces used flamethrowers not as rare specialized tools, but as standard infantry equipment distributed throughout divisions. By 1944, Marine divisions carried 243 flamethrowers into combat. The fuel consumption rates, 10,000 gallons per day at the height of Iwo Jima, represented logistical capacity that kept pace with tactical demand.
When portable flamethrowers proved too vulnerable, flame tanks were produced and shipped. When improved fuel formulations were developed, they were manufactured in quantity and delivered to combat units. This was industrial warfare in its purest form. Victory went not just to the side with better tactics or braver soldiers, but to the side that could produce, transport, and employ overwhelming material advantages. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima fought with extraordinary courage and determination. Their fortifications represented sophisticated military engineering. Their willingness to die rather than surrender demonstrated unshakable commitment. None of it mattered when confronted with an enemy who could project fire at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit into every defensive position, sustain that capability for weeks, and replace losses faster than defenders could inflict them. The flame attacks on Iwo Jima and subsequent islands were not isolated tactical innovations. They were manifestations of the industrial and material superiority that determined the Pacific War's outcome. The weapons existed because America's factories could build them. They were used extensively because logistics networks could supply them. They succeeded because no defensive preparation could overcome that fundamental disparity. The flamethrower remained in American military service for 3 decades after World War II. It saw extensive use in Korea, where napalm consumption reached 230,000 liters on an average.
Day during heavy fighting. It was employed throughout the Vietnam War, both in portable versions carried by infantry and in mechanized versions mounted on armored vehicles. The M22 gave way to the M2A17, which featured improved reliability and safety features. But the fundamental design remained similar to what Hershel Williams had carried on Iwo Jima. But even as the weapon continued in service, its nature was understood differently. What the Chemical Warfare Service had once characterized in 1944 as a mercy killer, producing quick, painless death, was recognized by war's end as one of combat's most horrific weapons. Studies of flamethrower effects on human bodies revealed that death was rarely instantaneous. Severe thermal injuries, smoke inhalation, oxygen depletion in enclosed spaces, these killed in ways that were neither quick nor merciful. The psychological impact on both users and victims was profound and lasting. Flamethrower operators who survived carried memories that many could not discuss. Victims who survived, rare though they were, bore scars both physical and psychological that never healed. Even soldiers who simply witnessed flame attacks often described them as uniquely disturbing compared to other forms of combat violence. International humanitarian law began addressing incendiary weapons, though never banning them outright. The psychological and physical effects were too severe, the suffering too extreme, for the international community to ignore entirely. Yet the weapons remained militarily effective, particularly against fortified positions, and no nation with the capability to produce them was willing to surrender that capability completely. The United States military officially retired flamethrowers in 1978. The Department of Defense determined they were of questionable effectiveness in modern combat. Precision-guided munitions could accomplish similar tactical objectives with less risk to operators and less controversial effects. The last American infantry flamethrower, the M97 used in Vietnam, was removed from service. The weapon that had been central to Pacific victory 33 years earlier was deemed obsolete. But the legacy extended beyond the weapon itself. The battles where flamethrowers proved decisive, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, taught lessons that influenced American military doctrine for decades. Fortifications, no matter how sophisticated, had vulnerabilities. Defenders willing to die in place could still be defeated if attackers had weapons that made the positions themselves uninhabitable. The psychological dimension of warfare mattered as much as the physical. For the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, the memory of flamethrowers became inseparable from the memory of the battle itself.
the acrid smell of diesel smoke mixed with burning napalm, the black clouds rising from pillboxes, the knowledge that every yard of volcanic ash had been won through methods that pushed the boundaries of what men could be asked to do and what other men could be forced to endure. Hershel Williams, in his later years, spoke at memorial services and veteran gatherings. He emphasized not the glory of his Medal of Honor action, but the cost of the battle, the men who died beside him, the terrible necessity of what they had done. He dedicated himself to honoring Gold Star families, those who had lost service members in America's wars. His message was consistent. Remember the cost, honor the sacrifice, work for peace. The Flamethrowers' story in World War II, from its rushed development in 1940 to its extensive use in Pacific combat to its eventual retirement decades later, traces the arc of a weapon that was necessary, effective, and deeply troubling. It solved tactical problems that could not be solved otherwise. It saved American lives by making Japanese fortifications untenable. It accomplished these things through methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about acceptable forms of warfare. The collision between Japanese defensive preparations and American incendiary weapons on Iwo Jima represented not just a tactical turning point in one battle, but a demonstration of industrial warfare's capacity to overcome any defense through the application of overwhelming, horrific force. The young man from West Virginia who crawled across volcanic ash with 70 pounds of death on his back understood this complexity better than most. He had done what was necessary. He had survived when most did not. And he carried the weight of those hours for the rest of his long life, a reminder that victory in modern war comes at costs that outlast the battles themselves. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.